Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is a special guest, Isabelle McRae. She's the director of the Restart Initiative, consultant for the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics, and a specialist on strategy, development, research, and languages. We'll be discussing her work with the civil society and her fascinating insights in what is going on in those sectors today, ranging from Iraq to South Caucasus. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into the heart of our discussion, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what is the Restart Initiative? What is the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics? What do you do?
Absolutely. Hi, Irina. It's really lovely to be here with you. So, my background, I started working in Turkey in the South Caucasus a few years ago, actually. Initially, I was involved in international education, and then I got into, well, a pretty strong interest in how societies deal with conflict and how they begin to heal after conflict. So I was interested in conflict studies and conflict resolution, and that ultimately led me to the UK to pursue further studies in at the London School of Economics around these issues, and especially around political agency of displaced peoples, refugees, migrant groups. So I spent quite a bit of time doing field work on those topics in the South Caucasus and Turkey. And over the last few years, I've been working mainly as a consultant with economic development projects, as well as peace building track two projects. So that connects to my work with Restart Initiative. Restart is a small NGO. We're registered in Tbilisi, Georgia. I'm sure we'll get into some of that later on today. And we do work around economic connectivity in the South Caucasus and in Central Asia, um, especially bringing people together in dialogue to build projects around mutual interest and mutual benefit, especially between Armenia and Azerbaijan. My work with the Center for Geopolitics is a bit more wide-reaching. I work on all of our development and strategy, and the Center for Geopolitics is a small research sort of think tank center based at Cambridge University. Um, and our main mission is to bring together practitioners and historians, academics, people with deep area knowledge to help inform and influence, but also be part of better understandings for policymakers. So we do that in a lot of different ways, and also look at a lot of different parts of the world with our work there. So
That
that's me to start.
That is really fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace dialogue because this is the area that I've been myself quite involved in over the years, and of
Yeah.
course, there's been many false starts, but in also an ongoing formal peace process between the government. So I am curious how, in parallel, this sort of track to diplomacy is working. Who are the main actors? Are these the NGOs? Are these think tanks? Are these just regular people coming together? And how can we get more information about it, given that the news seems to only cover official top level government initiatives?
Yeah, that's good questions. So I would say certainly there has been years of initiatives around building dialogue at the track two level between civil society organizations in Armenia and Azerbaijan, between think tanks, um, and that does involve regular people who are part of the societies there, and seeks to influence what might be happening on the political level, but of course with the understanding that without certain formal peace processes, there's only so much that you can do on the track two level.
Mhm.
So the work that I've been involved in that respect has mainly focused on technical peace building or really building economic capacity, building technical capacity, with the idea that when there is a normalization and a formal process, a lot of these relationships and these ideas that we have been building behind closed doors over the last few years might be able to take off in really concrete ways in terms of stimulating economic development, stimulating regional projects, and other types of cross-border projects. Um, so I definitely agree with you. There's a lot of this dialogue work because of the sensitivity, because of the history of conflict and ongoing sensitivities with the Karabakh conflict. Most of it happens behind closed doors. That said, there have been these ongoing initiatives like the one that I'm part of, that have been supported by the European Union, for
Mhm.
example, and other third countries that are interested in seeing development and dialogue, even in the absence of a normalization.
So actually, let's take it back to a very basic level for our audience in case people are
Yeah.
not familiar what track two is. I think there's a lot of rumors, a lot of discussions, and there's been a lot of prominent cases, but a lot of the times people don't know exactly what it entails and what the goal is. So, what is track two diplomacy as opposed to just any general intercultural dialogue? What is the specific objective?
So the specific objective is to bring people together who are not just politicians, government, decision makers, but really people at different levels of society with the explicit idea that engaging in dialogue will further better relations and more peaceful relations usually between two countries. So in the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, that work often has been at the civil society level, bringing together people who are perhaps involved in NGOs, perhaps involved in business community, perhaps involved in other types of work which is not directly governmental related,
Mhm.
and building those relationships of trust and open conversation through dialogue.
Generally speaking, what does trust building entail in this context? Because obviously, the whole point is to bring together people who are not who have very deeply held grievances, a lot of distrust between them, and are reluctant to do so. But at the same time, you identify people who are open to that possibility because this is sort of ends up being a self-selecting process of sorts.
Yes. Yeah, that's definitely true. It is not an easy it is not an easy thing to bring people to the table, and it's not an easy thing for people to come to the table. When there has been decades of conflict, when there has been very few, perhaps no opportunities to have conversations with people who are on the other side of the border, that it is a very sensitive situation. And so in the work that I've seen with a lot of organizations who are involved in dialogue, peace building, um, I think it really takes initial early adopters, having some people in each society who maybe have experience being in dialogue, maybe they have experience in some types of relationship building with people on the other side, and they're willing to advocate for the process and they're willing to help guide people who might be new and very uncertain about engaging in these types of things.
Mhm.
Um, to kind of to create a safe space, so that people feel comfortable sitting down at the same table.
So, couple of questions from a technical perspective. How do you identify appropriate candidates, and at what point does your role come in terms of, first of all, bringing them together, and then knowing when this project has run its course? Does it come when the country's formally normalized? Does it come when the two parties decide, okay, we are good friends now on a personal level, so we don't need mediation anymore? How does that work?
Mhm. Well, I can speak just from the project that I'm involved in. So I'll use that as an
Mm-hmm.
example with the understanding that people who might be involved in different versions of this, different types of dialogue might have a different practice or experience. In the work that we've done, we have very much relied on a local steering group. So, for example, we have people who've have been part of our community, have been supporters of our project for a long time in Armenia and Azerbaijan, who can lead on some of the recruitment and some of the initial explain to potential participants what it will involve, what it will be like, identifying potential people who would be willing to engage. Um, so for us, for example, we have this project called the Economic Connectivity Armenia-Azerbaijan Dialogue Series. This is through my organization Restart Initiative together with the Hertie School in Berlin. And now we're on our third year of this project. And so there are a lot of people who have heard about us and some people who have been involved directly in our dialogues. And so we do rely in a way on this type of reference type of instrument so that people might refer new participants into the organization and to the dialogue process. So that's kind of how it works initially. And when we identify a subject that we want to focus the dialogue on, for example, this summer we did one on women water experts, so women who are
Mm-hmm.
working in water security in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so we reached out to people who were involved in that type of work, had them refer us to other people, and sort of went on a network basis.
So,
Um,
so it's not really the same participants every time. It's different
no,
practitioners from different areas coming
exactly.
together for individual dialogue. So how do you ensure continuity that after one discussion, it doesn't just all fall apart and that people continue working together, staying in touch?
That's a great question. Something that we have to prove to ourselves for our EU funding. So very topical. Um, and I would say that there are different formats. The discussion, the ECADS format that we have, a lot of those we usually have participants who have been in the dialogue previously. We'll have one or two people from the Armenian side, the Azerbaijani side, and then newer participants. And it is really important for us to be involving new people into this
Mm-hmm.
network. Um, and we have noticed really positive knock-on effects from that in terms of people staying in communication with each other, people developing new trilateral, bilateral projects after the dialogue. And so there are certainly different formats. I have some colleagues with other organizations who have these type of bilateral dialogues that will always involve the same amount of people over a certain amount of time, a year, for example. Ours, we have focused more on bringing in new practitioners and new experts as opposed to always doing it with the same people. But
Mm-hmm.
there are pluses and minuses to those different formats.
Uh, Not to be negative, but have there been challenges with, for instance, diaspora communities or third parties with an interest in these issues interfering or trying to disrupt the process?
Well, For for the most part, no. And that is because we take a lot of care in setting up this process and also because the dialogues themselves are held in a neutral third country. They're held by invitation only behind
Mhm.
closed doors. Um, but certainly what you're saying, I mean, eh, there are there are diaspora groups who have very strong feelings about whether people should be engaging with the other side in whatever conflict or
So,
post-conflict you're looking at. And so I think that comes in more to play with public events that we do or public facing communications that we have about our projects.
mhm.
But I think the most important thing for us is that we are a trusted partner on both sides, and that
Mhm.
both our Armenian colleagues and our Azerbaijani colleagues see that we have everyone's best interest in mind.
So what does it stake to be perceived as a good faith partner who is able to be objective, given that the whole point of the conflict is that people are not objective. They have very strong
Yeah.
feelings, they have very strong narratives about their conflicts, and a lot of the times they perceive neutral parties as not neutral by virtue of not siding with them.
Hmm. Hmm. It's a great question, Irina. I mean, I think you cannot do this type of work effectively with if you do not aspire to neutrality. I think that uh, and the way you have to do it, especially, is how you format things, how you
Mhm.
invite people. For us, I mean, it's so important that we have equal representation from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, that we have equal input from our steering group in both countries, and that all of the projects that we put forward are in collaboration and in conversation with all of those stakeholders. Um, and and certainly it's the work that we do in the Caucasus. It's not an easy area to be doing this type of work. As you mentioned in the beginning, there are political constraints, there are geopolitical constraints, and a situation to be taken into consideration. And so for us, we put a lot of consideration into how we present our work to external partners, to governments, to the EU, to make sure that we really are basing the work that we do on both sides, and with the overall idea that we are trying to do something of mutual benefit and mutual interest, and we're not taking a side in that.
Going back to something you mentioned just now, how do you present your work to the public? Obviously, you mentioned you need to recruit new people without sharing it to some extent to the public. It's very difficult to do. How do you do that and without kind of setting off, chaos and controversy?
Um, well, we I mean, we have been doing a lot of work in developing our own communications and our own side of things. One of the arms, I would say, of Restart's work, which is more with my colleague Emin Mili, is we have a YouTube channel, somewhat similar to yours in that they're long form interviews with experts from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, from Europe, who are really there to normalize discussions, these types of discussions around economic development, around politics, in a civil setting. And so that's also a way that we try to share about our work, because it mirrors the type of dialogue that we want to be having and that we do have in our closed door dialogues. So that's one of those ways. And at the moment, we're doing a lot of outreach and just organizing events, going to events, speaking with diplomats, speaking with other NGOs, and building our network in that way.
So you mentioned the project on economic connectivity, and it's very topical because I kind of wanted to tie it back to some of your work in Turkey,
Yeah.
given a lot of what's going on in terms of economic corridors, both in South Caucasus and the Middle East, including through Iraq, that Turkey has been planning. To what extent does your work with civil society intersect with these larger economic projects?
So I think that it's very topical, sorry, very topical in terms of this is the context that we're working in.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, today I was at a great event. Well, maybe this will be last week, next time this goes live, but with the Caspian Policy Center, looking at economic development and green energy after COP29 in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And these this type of discussion, which is happening in a larger international and interstate type of way right now, is very much relevant to the work that we're doing, even if we do it at a very small level with 10 to 20 people in a room.
Mm-hmm.
um, the themes around connectivity are extremely topical, and right now, for example, because COP was hosted in Azerbaijan this year, we've been doing a lot more work around climate change adaptability, around water
Mhm.
security, energy. These topics are of huge interest for nations across Eurasia and beyond. And while we often do look at the quite nitty-gritty technical aspects of projects specifically in the South Caucasus region, I mean, we see these larger movements, as you're talking about the new development road project between Iraq and Turkey, the Middle Corridor conversation, and developments of other energy pathways through Central Asia to Europe. And so I think all of these are informing the direction that we're also going in with our work in a kind of macro and micro type of way.
That's fantastic, and kind of bringing it back somewhat to Turkey before we move on
Mhm.
to Iraq. I'm curious. You mentioned you work with refugees, with the how that's in some ways it's very different from your these diplomatic public diplomacy initiatives, and obviously Turkey is a huge venue, a huge forum for these types of projects, given the huge Syrian and other diaspora communities it is
Yeah.
hosting. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how that works, and there's of course political and cultural challenges that come with it as well.
This is might be a whole new topic to get into. I guess where to start for your listeners. One thing to know certainly is that Turkey is one of the largest hosts of refugees in the world. But for the most part, those refugees do not have what we would call in the West refugee or asylum status. And so either they're from Syria, perhaps from Iraq, they have temporary protective status. Um, but over the last few years, you've also seen in Turkey a huge influx of people from other countries, nearby countries, such as Iran, such as Afghanistan,
Mhm.
and even farther afield, Pakistan, who come through the eastern borders of Turkey and either stay in Turkey or are in the process of trying to transit into the European Union or further afield from there. And so um, I guess there are a lot of different consequences of that. I mean, and they have become factors in current discussions around Turkey's politics and Turkey's economic situation, certainly in Turkey's external relations with the EU, for example, as a bordering country, which has a lot of people in transit within its borders. And the Turkish government has used the refugee, what we used to call the refugee crisis, and now has become sort of the status quo as
Mhm.
a bargaining tool in its relations with Europe, for example. So I guess what to say further on that topic, it is hugely important to people in Turkey. It's a huge part of the public discourse around refugees, migrants, people who are from elsewhere ending up in Turkey. And a lot of people perceive the burden on the economy for that reason. But the huge amount of informal labor, which is also provided in vast parts of the agricultural, the industrial, the textile type of sectors in Turkey is not necessarily shown as much in that discourse. So I'm happy to answer further questions, but that's
And where does your work come in? What specifically are you trying to do with these refugees, and and given how many of them there are, how do you focus your work?
so these days I'm not doing too much work on this topic, but
Mm-hmm.
previously I used to work with NGOs in Turkey who were really focused on programs which supported Syrian refugees and also other migrant groups in Turkey. But I also did my field research when I was doing my graduate degree on informal migrant labor in Turkey. So I have a bit of a both academic and practitioner background in this topic. And a lot of work that I had been doing previously was around capacity building, around entrepreneurship training, um, with the idea that because a lot of people are living in quite precarious conditions, they're also working in very precarious conditions. And um, part of the work that we were doing was try to help people build more sustainable ways to earn money and create better lives for themselves. But it was very much and continues to be within a system which makes it somewhat hard to do that.
Do you expect the current developments in Syria to impact the situation? And if so, how?
The situation of refugees, of displaced people in Turkey.
Yes. Do you think
Yeah.
first of all, do you think there's going to be a new refugee crisis depending on how things go in Syria? And or do you expect, let's say, if the Assad regime is displaced, do you expect some of these refugees to return home, for instance?
So I guess to back it up, because we've had now some days and what will probably be weeks of reignition of conflict in Syria. But to look back to discussions, Erdogan had entered into discussions with Bashar al-Assad earlier this year around normalizing relations with Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that discussion, and certainly part of the reason for those discussions, has been this grievance against Syrian refugees in Turkey and the idea that they can send part of that population back to Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, if relations were more normalized with Syria, then that would enable the Turkish government to support that more openly. Um, and I think that those normalization talks are very interesting to look at in the context of now the essentially the destruction really of Hezbollah in the last months and the
Mm-hmm.
weakening of Iran's force in Syria and this concern that that might lead to a type of destabilizing vacuum, which would be dangerous for Turkey, both in terms of potential migration flows, but also in terms of its questions around the Kurdish groups in Syria and the Kurdish
Mm-hmm.
population. Um, so now, in light of the new developments in Syria and the new movements of militant groups and the takeover of Aleppo and displacement of people internally, we're already seeing the displacement of Kurdish and other populations in northern Syria. Will that spill over into the border into Turkey? Most likely it will. I think it's too early to say where this is going to go. I I do hope that it will not escalate further,
Mm-hmm.
but things are very much up in the air right now.
Taking it in a slightly different direction, coming back to this issue of economic connectivity and the Iraqi corridor, do you think there is a role for these refugees to be played in terms of facilitating some of the economic activity given their intercultural uh, is there an intercultural role that they could
Mm,
play a positive role, given that many of them are Arabic speaking, given that Afghanistan and Pakistan are also strategically important locations for the flow of goods and people?
mhm. It's a very good question. I would like to think so. I mean, I would like to think that that would create more opportunity. However, I'm pessimistic when you look at the numbers of people who are in Turkey, the numbers of people who may not necessarily be in strategic
Mhm.
positions in which to be
Sure.
taking kind of leading economic roles or leading facilitation roles in these relationships. Um, However, I think it's something which is worth looking at.
I haven't seen that issue addressed, given that there are literally masses of people, many with families, and on the other hand, economic revitalization of any sort creates vast opportunities. It seems like a tremendous waste of potential and a humanitarian and a security problem to just have these people living in camps or de facto these really unstable economic and
Yeah.
social situations, instead of finding a role for them to play that they could work, they could maybe relocate elsewhere and kind of, also benefit from the opportunities from this corridor and economic activity.
I completely agree with you. Yes. And I think specifically, if we're taking it back to the conversation of the new development road project,
Mm-hmm.
there is still a huge amount of uncertainty of how those railways, roads are going to go through northern Iraq, how, because there is still a huge amount of instability there with the PKK, with Kurdish and Turkish fighting in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And and as well, there are still camps, there are still displaced people, and we will have to see. We'll have to see how it develops.
Well, that's really a great transition point to the next part of the discussion, which is Iraq and what's going on here. How is the civil society functioning? One of the major developments is the expected withdrawal of US forces from Iraq. How will that affect the social situation and the security of these more vulnerable groups and civil, and what can we expect from civil society inside the country?
So I will give a caveat first that I am not an Iraq expert,
Mhm.
but I was recently on a trip to the Kurdish regional government area for the Middle East Peace and Security Conference in Dohuk. And so I had a lot of great conversations with people who are Iraqi, who are Kurdish, who are involved in civil society, in academia and government there. And right now, it seems to me that there is a huge amount of uncertainty of what will happen with the drawdown of the U.S. coalition. Um, it really, I mean, it will be the end of a huge era when that happens, but it's still not entirely clear to what extent will the U.S. withdraw from Iraq. There's still a huge air base in Erbil. They're building one of what I think is supposed to be the largest consulate in the Middle East in Erbil now for
Mhm.
the US consulate to switch over to. And so it's clear that while we don't know what will happen in the next year, especially with the Trump administration and Iraq US Kurdish relations, um, this, there are still interests there from the side of the US coalition side. But what will that relationship look like in 2025? There are so many question marks. And then to get to your question of how that will affect civil society, um, again, I won't claim to have a deep knowledge of this, but I would say that the type of perhaps lack of security and the insecurity that might be generated from this drawdown, and generally the tensions and neighboring conflicts that are happening around Iraq, um, would put civil society in quite a precarious position, because regardless, when you're getting to an existential insecurity, that's not going to help the flourishing of civil society, of education, of technological development. And that's really what people would like to be focusing on. Um, but we will have to see.
So that brings me to the point about your trip. You said you've been having a lot of these discussions. Among the sense of uncertainty, what are some of the top priorities, top concerns, and are there, what ways are there to engage with people who seem to be sort of left out of these formal political decision-making processes? US and others are, while they're having obviously discussions with the Kurdish regional government, their main uh, interchange is with Baghdad. And of course, there's
Yeah.
been a lot of tensions, and now there's the element of Turkey going after PKK and this whole situation in Syria. And what do you see happening? What is the current framework, and what does the KRG look for in the near future, and with whom?
Mm. Well, certainly this you brought up tension, and that is definitely what I heard from many colleagues during
Hmm.
my time there. This tension between Erbil and Baghdad, and as the Kurdistan regional government has tried to become more autonomous, tried to develop its democracy, tried to develop its economic independence, it is bound to Baghdad, and it is under the overall umbrella of the Iraqi constitution. And I certainly heard a lot of conversations around how this relationship is challenging because of the geopolitical issues with Iraq's neighbors and the Kurdistan regional government's neighbors, that it feels quite closely, especially to the north and to the west. It it is bound by this, especially around the financing and the oil revenues and the distribution of oil revenues back to
Hmm.
Kurdistan regional government. I heard a lot about this and how it's been quite a lot of push and pull, I think. And so in that context, I mean, there are larger conversations going on around the development of a regional security infrastructure and whether Iraq and certainly other countries in the Middle East are now at a point where the US hegemony is waning.
Hmm.
There's huge uncertainty in the region and outside of the region. And are we now getting to a point where the countries in the Middle East need to create some level of understanding with each other and some level of security? It doesn't have to be, as we were discussing in the conference, it doesn't have to be all, oh, we're best friends now. That's really unrealistic, but something, some level of cooperation, some new level of cooperation that can create more security, but also support larger types of economic development and connectivity, of technological development that some would say has fallen behind in some of the countries in the region, and now how do they jumpstart that and and feed off of each other? I mean, that might be a little bit abstract, but I think that there is this real acknowledgement of, well, the US is perhaps becoming a less predictable ally, and we need to be looking out for ourselves. And how do we do that? And who are going to be our partners in that?
Is it possible that we can see more than one regional security cooperation bloc? Because I just do not see all these conflicting interests being resolved with one security infrastructure, given that even what constitutes a threat really depends on who you
Yeah,
who you
yeah,
ask. You have
definitely.
Iran and Turkey is two of the major regional powers conflicting in Iraq, and that's just in Iraq and Syria, for instance, you have the Gulf states which have their own bloc normalizing with Iran trying to manage things with Turkey as well. And of course, you have semi non-state actors like Kurds and assorted others who are being affected by these larger forces and who are looking to, and who among themselves have a great deal of political differences.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. It might be a very idealistic position to take. Um, and I don't think it's one that you can just say, okay, a blanket, like everyone's gonna get along. Of course, it's not possible. And maybe that's something that you have smaller regional security agreements or some kind of architecture that starts to allow for more cooperation. Um, but I again would say that there are people who can speak more knowledgeably on this
Mhm.
topic than I can. Yeah.
In terms of the economic aspects of this situation, again, given a complete lack of clarity, for instance, Iran and Turkey cooperate in some areas and they have their competition and conflicts in other areas. And we're
Yeah.
seeing some of this playing out by proxy in Syria and through this new, through the Turkish-led economic corridor initiatives. But on the other
Hmm.
hand, when it comes to the issue of some of the Kurdish concerns, Iran and Turkey have been in very close cooperation. So, in terms of these connectivity projects, in terms of the flow of trade, where do you see things going? Who can dominate the current? Who will dominate, or will anyone dominate the current the economic infrastructure?
Yeah.
How are these forces going to play out in terms of the security, uncertainty, and tensions?
Well, I think that Turkey is in a good position to take a lead role in this, certainly if we're
Mhm.
looking at this part of the Middle East. Um, and why do I think that? Well, it certainly is it's at a level of interconnectedness with global markets, which you don't necessarily have, certainly in Iran, Iraq, and okay, to use that classic cliche, it's a bridge between East and West. And that really allows it to potentially take on a connectivity role in a far greater way when we look forward into the near midterm future. And it will have to make some concessions to do that. Certainly because its biggest weak spot is its internal issues with its own Kurdish communities and Kurdish
Mhm.
population. And and so now I think very interestingly, we're seeing this initial discussions around rapprochement with the PKK.
Mhm.
And I think that the idea of addressing that internal security weakness is part of the larger external plan to be a connecting country, to become a more dominant middle power in the Middle East, but also as a bordering Europe, and holding a very strategic position between Eurasia, Europe, and it, yeah, that's my initial thoughts. Especially as we've also seen the Erdogan's government, for example, making overtures around strengthening its image, its diplomatic efforts with Iran, with Russia, even on Israel and Gaza. And uh, while those might not necessarily be the most substantive relationships in the region, it's showing we're here. We
Mhm.
can play this role as a potential security guarantor. We can play this role as a mediator between conflicting powers in the region. And we can also use our industrial domestic economy as the basis for some larger level of economic connectivity.
Well, that raises a very obvious, elephant in the room, which is Turkish economy. Given the struggles it has had with
Yeah.
inflation, can it seriously can it seriously go after a leadership role in the region if internally you have very significant economic challenges and there is no clear path to addressing them? Or is Turkey hoping that this external projection of power can bring in the capital that it takes to resolve those internal concerns?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem for Turkey domestically, and it's a huge problem for Erdogan's government, as we've seen over the last years with Turkish elections and um, Erdogan suddenly, after decades of being in power, finding himself on unsteady footing. And a lot of that having to do with the huge decline in people's standards of living, in massive inflation that's happened in Turkey over the last years due to very poor economic policies. And so what are the economic prospects, I mean, for really turning that around? I do not know, but I agree with you, your second point, in that I think that if Turkey can play its role as this kind of in between mediating external power, then it can attract some level of finance and strengthening of its own economy and hopefully turn things around a bit. But again, I'm not entirely sure how that will play out given the situation that it is in now. But that, in the very least, is what it's projecting to do.
Well, that brings me right next to the next point of discussion. You mentioned Turkey's relations with Russia. They've been complex over the years, to put it mildly. They've been complex over 100 years. Let's be clear,
Yeah.
starting with the Turkish-Russian wars and Russia's interest in the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which are not going anywhere, which have played a strategic role in limiting Russia's reach during the war with Ukraine. Now, Turkey certainly is using that to its advantage while continuing its financial relations with Russia. But there's also been competition in geographic territorial disputes, South Caucasus being
Mhm.
primarily one of them. And whereas Turkey is clearly edging out Russia economically in places like Azerbaijan, and where Armenia is certainly trying to turn away from Russia. Georgia is one of the places where Russia still has a lot of hold and where Turkey clearly does not. And speaking of Georgia, we've been seeing a lot of activity by on the grassroots level over the past few weeks, and there's a crucial presidential election upcoming. There's questions whether the government could fall given the number of resignations in the past few days, including the ambassador to the US. What do you make of all of this?
On the Georgia side specifically,
Mm-hmm.
yes, there is so much happening right now, and it's happening at such a fast rate. I mean, we held a panel discussion on Georgian geopolitics and politics since the election just last week. Um, and now in the last several days, we've seen some of the biggest, most violent protests on the streets of Tbilisi and other cities in Georgia in continued resistance to the Georgian dream, and especially following the news that the EU has decided to put all accession talks on hold for the next 4 years, and the Georgian dream has decided to put all conversations on hold for the next 4 years with the EU, and that this has been following huge criticisms of this election being rigged potentially, or I mean, there have been huge allegations that the winning of the election was not free or fair. And I mean, the larger takeaway, and this was something which came up in discussions I've had with other experts on Georgian civil society representatives and academics, is is that Georgia really did represent a beacon of doing things a different way. And it really does seem like Russia has taken that to heart and taken through through not to say that there are just the Georgian dream is just a proxy of Russia. That is extremely way too simple. Um, but that Georgia really does find itself in a very tense place, and many people in Georgia feel that they are in a uh, East meets West conflict, East versus West conflict right
Mm-hmm.
now, and that it is an absolutely existential imperative around which direction the country is going to go in now and how that will dictate what Georgia looks like in the future. And so, I mean, it's hard to even describe, I think, the level of distress which many people are feeling in Georgia right now, and we're seeing that on the streets. Um, And will that make the government cave? We'll see. But I think that there's a lot of influence and a lot of money that certainly went into winning the last election, and that those who have gotten the power will want to hold on to it. So um, it's certainly a situation which I'm following closely and have a lot of concerns about.
Well, the big question, of course, is the law about the foreign agency. How does it affect these grassroots efforts? Can it be utilized more prominently to make false accusations of Western interference with these protests? Already we're seeing regional comparisons to the Euromaidan in Ukraine back in
Yeah.
2014 and claims that CIA made that happen and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, the foreign agents law in Georgia, when it passed, there was huge protest against it and huge protest beforehand because this is also a law which is in effect in Russia, and it requires any organization, civil society organization or media company, if they have more than, I think it's 20% foreign funding or donations, are declared foreign agents. Um, and the immediate implications of that are no one is entirely certain what's going on. I mean, it's thrown the whole civil society into um, really into a precarious situation because it's not entirely sure what happens to their accounts, how you have to declare yourself. And beyond that, people are looking at how Russia itself has used this foreign agent law to criminalize people who are involved in civil society, involved in activism, involved in independent media. And that is a very terrifying prospect because Georgia has a very strong, vibrant, multifaceted civil society, and that has been one of the greatest holdouts of the slow and gradual measures which have taken place through the Georgian Dream and slow crackdown on different parts of Georgian government, politics, society. And now we're seeing that really hitting onto civil society, and the prospects for that are not positive.
What does it mean for people like you who are heavily engaged in civil society? Does it make it dangerous for you to travel there or to get involved in some way that's not, that takes you out of, where you are and having any direct connections on the ground?
Um, as I'm not Georgian, so the level of issues that I might face are certainly nothing compared to Georgian colleagues and what they might have to go through or might be going through currently. But that said, in terms of our organization, we already were facing huge obstacles just operating as an NGO in Georgia because of increasing administrative burden and new laws. And now with the foreign agents law, we're essentially at the point where we need to figure something else out and move our operations potentially to Europe. Um, because the other side of that is that it's made fundraising in general incredibly hard in Georgia. And both for the work that I do and for all other kinds of civil society organizations that are dependent, especially on foreign funding, this is a very difficult situation, both because the EU, things are not going well at the moment. The US has a huge amount of assistance, which is currently in the freezer that would go to Georgia ordinarily. Um, and so there's just a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen, how organizations are going to survive, and I do fear that this will have really negative impacts on many organizations' ability to do business at all.
So, if the Georgian Dream, uh, as a governing entity, is to survive, is it safe to say that the civil society in Georgia might be facing complete collapse?
I I don't know if complete collapse, if we're at that point right now. I think there is so much strong resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if we were looking at the most pessimistic option for the future, perhaps then we could say that. I mean, if you look at Russia or Belarus as an example for the oppression of civil society, but Georgia is not at that point yet,
Mm-hmm.
and many people are working so that it does not get to that point.
Well, I think that's great news on some level. Is it fair to say some have described what is happening as almost an intergenerational conflict between the older generation and that's more socially conservative and the younger generation that's prioritizes kind of being part of the EU and having better relations with the West? Is that an accurate way of looking at things?
I'm sure that there's a generational factor
Mm-hmm.
if you look into people's preferences and the type of discourse which opposition parties and the Georgian Dream have employed that might be geared towards generational aspirations and those being different across different generational lines. Um, but I wouldn't suggest that it is the only reason that people voted a certain way or the only reason that we're seeing this level of division in society and in the political system.
We're seeing these huge monumental political shifts that are affecting civil societies. There's a lot of economic moves. We are seeing a lot of political and security moves. What is the best way to identify and to assist NGOs and organizations engaged in peace building, in dialogue, in humanitarian action, in sort of civil society action without kind of also ending up in a place where you are seen as a some sort of a foreign agent,
Mhm.
fostering revolutions or meddling in other people's business and so forth. How do you achieve that balance?
Yeah. Um, well, I think to the extent that it's possible, giving people a platform and sharing the ideas which are coming out of people on the ground, people from civil society, if we're talking about the Georgian case, people who really have knowledge of what's going on and have firsthand experience of the shifts that are taking place. Um, so to the extent that that's possible to share that information widely. If we're talking about governments, funders, I mean, there is a always a huge need for support of independent media, for support of organizations and the initiatives that they're trying to undertake in a flexible way, which is not purely constrained to short-term limited project funding. Um, that's of course my fundraising hat speaking here, but uh, I really see that. I mean, it's tough when you're working in the South Caucasus. It's a small part of the world. There are a lot of other conflicts and wars going on. It is not necessarily on everybody's minds, but I think that the factors which are part of the social political crisis in Georgia right now are factors that we also see in other conflicts and that can tell us about themes and trends and underlying currents which are happening geopolitically around the world, and that's worth paying attention to.
So to wrap things up, I'm seeing like one interesting trend. The South Caucasus is often described as a bridge between the East and the West, but right now both the East and the West are facing their own conflict, Russia and Ukraine. In the West, assorted Middle Eastern flashpoints between Iran and its proxies, Israel, and also affecting Arab states in the Middle East. And now you're seeing this connecting point, suffering tensions, social incohesion, interference from third party actors. How is the fact that this connecting point between these two already conflicted areas is itself maybe soon on fire, or there is at least a
Mm,
high degree of level of interference from these other actors? How do you think it may affect these East-West um, different conflicts
mm,
that, by the way, seem to be also polarizing the conversation because the
mhm.
Middle East experts are not really looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. The Russia-Ukraine war people are not really all that interested in the Middle East, but in reality, you see that the actors behind the tensions are
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah, uh, I completely agree with that, Irina. And that's really where I think the ideas of geopolitics can help us. I know that for lots of folks, geopolitics might sound like this very perhaps archaic political science IR term that just sounds very Cold War, but but in a way it gives us a framework to look at how actors beyond just state actors, but also non-state, also sub-state actors, um, also elites and ruling families might be part of larger interstate and intrastate dynamics. And so it can allow us to look at actors in different contexts and in different parts of the world, like Russia, like Iran, like Turkey, and see how their own rationale might be playing out in these other theaters and look at things in a more holistic way. And I think even you don't have to be an expert on this or that region to develop an understanding of that and for that understanding to help you understand those regions better.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much. This has been enlightening, and I think, although we touched on many subjects, actually, it's very easy to see that to some extent, these issues are interconnected. They're interconnected both
Yeah.
in terms of the fact of economic and social factors, geographical factors, but also political role that bigger state actors and movements are playing across the board. And I think work such as yours is vital to help highlight these issues to try to find at least some limited and local solutions or pathways to solutions. And I wish you the best of success in the future because it's certainly going to be very interesting for a very long time.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. We covered a lot of ground in this conversation, so thanks for the time.
Thank you so much. And for everyone watching us, we'll be back next Tuesday night, 9 p.m., the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you. And thank you to Isabelle McRae for joining us today. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.